Okay, so we're diving deep today, right? Taking a good look at some excerpts you sent over from Friedrich Nietzsche's The Gay Science.
That's right.
And, we're trying to do what we always do, pull out those key ideas, help people get a handle on these thinkers.
Yeah. This one, he's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Nietzsche can be. A lot of people find him intimidating, but, it's worth the effort. There's so much in the gay science specifically about like knowledge and morality and, of course, the individual.
Definitely. His views are just so unexpected.
Yeah, and that's what we're after, right? Those unexpected turns that can really change how you look at things.
Totally.
So, mission for today then is to pull out those nuggets, the ones that make you kind of rethink the world and even yourself.
Exactly.
And I think one of the first things that jumps out, at least for me, is Nietzsche's take on, well, what we usually call evil.
Yeah, he really gets you there, like right out of the gate.
Because, we think of things like hatred or taking pleasure in other people's misfortune as just, bad.
Purely negative.
Right. But Nietzsche, he's looking deeper and he's saying, look, these instincts, they might be ugly, but they've actually been a factor in our survival as a species.
Yeah, it's not about morality for him, at least not in the way we usually think of it. It's more about effectiveness, what actually worked to keep us around.
Right. Like, whether we like to admit it or not, these less than admirable instincts, they were part of the mix, and they helped us get to where we are.
And that really gets you thinking, doesn't it? Like maybe our moral judgments, the ones we hold now, they don't always line up with the deeper, bigger story of how we got here.
It's kind of a humbling thought, right?
Totally.
Now, this idea of looking deeper, of questioning what we think we know, that leads into another big idea for Nietzsche, and that's what he calls the lack of intellectual conscience.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
And for me, this really speaks to anyone who's serious about knowledge, about really getting to the bottom of things.
Yeah, because Nietzsche's saying most people, even smart folks, they don't really examine the basis of their beliefs, the why.
It's like we're all walking around just accepting things.
Right, just taking them at face value.
And for Nietzsche, that's a problem.
He has this standard. He talks about looking for this feeling in other people, this discomfort with just believing things without being totally sure.
That resonates with me so much. It's like, have you ever had that thing where something just feels right, but you haven't really dug into it?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
And there's that little nag, right? Like, wait a minute. Do I actually know this is true?
He calls it an inmost craving, this need to know for certain. And I think that's something, we should all ask ourselves. Are we just content with surface level? Or do we really want to go deeper?
Right, because for Nietzsche, that deeper dive, that's where the real intellectual honesty is. And then he takes this even further, right? And he starts talking about these two different types of people, noble and common.
Yeah, and it's not about social class or anything like that.
Right, it's about their mindset, how they see the world.
So these common types, he says they're all about practicality. What's useful right now? What gets them ahead?
They're suspicious of anything that doesn't seem to benefit them directly.
Like if you tell them about someone who did something nice, totally selfless, they're immediately looking for the angle. Like, what's the catch? What's in it for them?
Right. They're squinting their eyes.
And if they can't find that selfish motive, they think the person's a fool.
Yeah. Or even worse, they get resentful.
Because to them, it's just irrational.
Yeah.
They can't grasp the idea that someone would intentionally put themselves at a disadvantage.
Their logic is like, look, always play it safe. Do what benefits you. Don't go around being all noble and generous for no reason.
It's a pretty limited way of seeing things.
But then Nietzsche throws in this curveball. He talks about the dignity of folly.
Yeah. Like, wait a minute, maybe there's something to be said for those actions that aren't, strictly rational or self-serving.
Right. What if there's value in doing things that don't have an immediate payoff?
What if those things actually lead to something bigger, more important?
It's like Nietzsche saying there's this whole realm of experience that these common types are missing out on.
And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real insights are. The ones that really change the game.
It's that willingness to embrace the unexpected, to maybe even look a little foolish in the pursuit of something greater.
Exactly. And that takes us to another surprising idea. This one about the role of evil in human progress.
Okay, this one's a bit jarring.
Because Nietzsche actually argues that it's often been the so-called evil spirits, the really strong, disruptive personalities, who have pushed humanity forward.
So not the nice guys, huh?
Not necessarily. He sees them as the ones who shake things up. who challenge the status quo,
Yeah.
who wake everyone up from their comfortable slumber.
They're the ones who say, hey, wait a minute, what if we tried it this way?
Right. And that can be unsettling. It forces people to compare, to reconsider what they believe.
It's like he's saying progress isn't always pretty. Sometimes it takes a little wickedness to get things moving.
He even compares these innovators to conquerors, not necessarily in a literal sense, but in their drive to overthrow the old ways.
Like they're conquering old ideas.
Exactly. He has this really stark line. He says, what is new is always evil, because it wants to conquer and overthrow the old boundary markers and the old pieties.
Wow.
And then he adds, and only what is old is good. So he's really highlighting that resistance to new ideas, isn't he? How people cling to what they know.
Because it's comfortable, it's safe.
Right. But Nietzsche's saying, look, if you want to move forward, you have to be willing to break things, to upset the apple carts.
And sometimes the people who do that, they don't look so virtuous.
At least not at first.
Interesting. So now let's talk about what Nietzsche calls unconditional duties.
Okay, yeah.
He's talking about these absolute non-negotiable demands, like rules you can't break, no matter what.
And he notices that people who want to be really influential, like revolutionary leaders or, powerful preachers.
Yeah, they often latch onto these unconditional duties.
Right, because it gives them this unwavering conviction, this sense of purpose.
Okay.
And that makes people trust them.
Because if you're going to convince people to follow you, to do something radical, you need to believe it yourself.
100%.
Yeah.
You need that rock-solid foundation.
And those absolute moral rules, those categorical imperatives, as some philosophers call them, they provide that foundation.
It's like they need that unbreakable commandment to build up their own confidence, and then they project that confidence out to everyone else.
It's a really interesting look at how influence works.
Definitely.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit here. Nietzsche also talks about these things he calls unconscious virtues.
Ah, yeah.
And this is more subtle, I think, but it's important.
It is. It's like he's saying some of the best things about us, they develop quietly. They're not showy.
They're not things we brag about or put on our resume.
Right, and they might even be hidden from people who know us well.
He compares them to those tiny, delicate sculptures you find on, like, reptile scales.
You need a special tool to even see them.
And they're not for defense or anything obvious like that. They have some other purpose.
Maybe we don't even fully understand it.
It's like, I don't know, it's a reminder that there's so much more to people than what's on the surface.
Absolutely.
All right. So then Nietzsche goes on to talk about this idea of the overestimation of consciousness.
Right, and this is a real mind bender.
Because he's saying that we think way too highly of our conscious awareness.
Like it's the most important thing about us.
Right, and he thinks that this actually holds us back.
Interesting.
Because if we think we're so conscious, we stop trying to develop it further.
It's like we're complacent.
Right. And he makes this really provocative claim.
Right.
He says that so far we've mostly just absorbed errors. And our consciousness, it's wrapped up in those errors.
Wow. So all this stuff we think we know for sure
Could be wrong.
could be based on faulty assumptions.
And I think for anyone who's trying to learn and grow, that's a huge point.
We need to be aware of those built-in errors if we
Yeah.
want to really make progress.
It's almost like we have to unlearn some things first.
Therefore, we can really learn.
Okay, so then there's this concept of the dignity of folly.
Yeah, which sounds a little paradoxical.
Right. But Nietzsche's being serious here. He's saying that in a future where everyone's obsessed with safety and predictability.
Like a really risk-averse world.
Yeah. The most noble act might be to embrace the unconventional, the seemingly irrational.
To do something that looks a little foolish.
Because it goes against the grain, it shakes things up.
It's like he's saying, don't be afraid to stand out, to challenge the norms, even if it means you look a little silly.
And maybe those follies are actually where the real breakthroughs happen.
Moments of true genius.
Now, another fascinating idea is this thing about appearance versus being and the power of names.
Ah, yes, names. So important to Nietzsche.
And he argues that what we call things, that actually has more impact than what they actually are.
It's about how we perceive things, how we label them.
Right. And he describes this process where, you give something a name, a reputation.
And then people start to believe it.
They repeat it. They reinforce it.
And eventually, that label, that appearance, it becomes the reality.
It's like the name actually creates the thing.
And the implications of that are pretty huge.
It's about the power of language, right?
And the stories we tell ourselves.
And how those stories shape our world.
Totally.
All right, so we have to talk about one of Nietzsche's most famous and I think powerful ideas.
Yeah.
The parable of the madman and the death of God.
This is a big one.
Yeah, it's this really striking image, this madman who bursts into a crowd of people and starts shouting that they've killed God.
And then he asks these really unsettling questions, like, how could we drink up the sea?
Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon?
It's this feeling of disorientation, like the ground has shifted beneath our feet.
Because for Nietzsche, it's not really about a literal God.
Right. It's about the loss of a shared foundation, a shared sense of meaning and value.
It's like we used to have this framework, this way of understanding the world, and now it's gone.
And the madman, he's asking, where do we go from here? What do we hold on to now?
It's a really powerful image of a world struggling to find its bearings. And it leads into Nietzsche's ideas about the will to truth.
Yes, the drive to uncover the truth.
Yeah.
But Nietzsche also warns us about the potential dangers of this pursuit.
Because it's not always comfortable, right?
No, and he even suggests maybe it's not just about avoiding deception from others. Maybe it's about being ruthlessly honest with ourselves.
And that can be really hard.
It can.
Because sometimes, you know, those comfortable lies, they make life a little easier.
And Nietzsche asks this really tough question. Why do we value truth so much when life itself seems to depend on appearances, on illusions, maybe even on a little self-deception?
Yeah, he even wonders if this drive to uncover the truth, if it could actually be a kind of will to death.
Because it goes against our natural instincts to protect ourselves, to see things in a way that helps us survive.
It makes you wonder, right, about the balance between seeking truth and just living.
And finding meaning and joy in the process.
Okay, so another big idea is Nietzsche's take on the herd instinct and how it relates to morality.
Yeah, he has a very particular view of morality.
He basically says that it's all rooted in this herd instinct, this need to fit in, to conform to the group.
To do what's good for the survival of the herd.
And that might mean suppressing your own individual instinct.
Right, because what matters is the well-being of the group.
And he's really skeptical of those seemingly selfless acts. He even famously says, no altruism.
Because he thinks ultimately everything we do is motivated by self-interest, even if it's unconscious.
So even when we think we're being selfless, there's some deeper motive at play.
Maybe.
Interesting. It's definitely a less romantic view of human nature.
It is.
All right, let's talk about art and the figure of the fool.
Okay, yeah.
Nietzsche, he has a lot to say about art.
He sees it as this really important tool for self-reflection.
It gives us that distance we need to look at ourselves critically.
To see our own flaws and contradictions.
And he talks about the need for this kind of joyful, playful art, this art that mocks and dances and celebrates.
He calls it exuberant, floating, divinely untroubled.
And it's important, he says, because it keeps us from becoming too serious, too bogged down by knowledge and morality.
It reminds us to be lighthearted, to have fun.
And he even talks about embracing the fool within ourselves, especially if we're naturally serious people.
Because that's where the creativity comes from, the ability to see things in a new way.
And to not take ourselves too seriously.
Definitely.
Now, Nietzsche has this kind of bleak view of the natural world.
Yeah, he describes it as, in all eternity, chaos.
Not in the sense of being completely random, but in the sense of lacking any kind of order or meaning that makes sense to us humans.
He says there's no inherent purpose.
Yeah.
No grand plan.
And he warns us against projecting our own human desires onto the universe.
Like wanting it to be beautiful or just or fair.
He's saying, look, the universe doesn't care about your human values.
It just is.
And that can be a tough pill to swallow.
It can.
And this leads into his idea that all knowledge is actually rooted in errors.
Yeah, he's saying that for a long time, the human mind, it only produced errors.
But some of those errors, they happen to be useful for our survival.
So we held on to them.
And they became these deeply ingrained beliefs. Things like the idea of substance, of equality, of free will.
And it wasn't until much later that we started to question these beliefs.
And then truth emerged.
But it's like truth is this fragile thing.
Almost an afterthought.
Right. And it might not even be compatible with how we're wired.
It's a humbling thought, right?
Totally.
Okay. Nietzsche also talks about these individuals he calls higher men.
Yeah, these are the people who, they don't need external validation. They have this inner strength.
They're not trying to climb the social ladder or impress anyone.
They just are.
And he contrasts them with the people who are always striving, always seeking approval.
And that ties into his whole idea of self-overcoming, this constant process of growth and transformation.
It's about challenging yourself, pushing your limits.
And coming out stronger on the other side.
He even talks about needing this like warlike soul to really push yourself intellectually.
To be willing to fight for your ideas. To be tough.
Because the truth, it doesn't always come easy.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, last thing. Nietzsche has some interesting thoughts about work, boredom, and pleasure.
Yeah, he's not a fan of just working for the sake of working. Or for money.
He thinks there should be some joy in it, some inherent satisfaction.
And he has this interesting view of boredom. He sees it as this necessary space for creative people.
Like you need those quiet moments, those moments of stillness to really let your mind wander.
And then the ideas can start to flow.
He even compares constantly distracting yourself from boredom to working without pleasure. He thinks it's vulgar.
It's like you're running away from yourself.
Yeah, and maybe those moments of boredom, they're actually really valuable.
Maybe that's where the real insights come from.
So Nietzsche, at the end of The Gay Science, he calls it art for artists.
What do you think he means by that?
I think he's saying that this book, these ideas, they're not for everyone.
They're for people who are already on a certain path.
People who are willing to wrestle with difficult questions, who are seeking something more.
And maybe those are the people who will find the most meaning in it.
It's like this shared journey of discovery. And maybe even joy.
Yeah, there is certain joy in it, isn't there?
So, we've covered a lot. And I think some of these ideas, they really stick with you, don't they?
Definitely.
Like that idea that maybe so-called evil instincts have actually been beneficial for us, and the fact that we might be overestimating our own consciousness.
And then there's that provocative thought about, maybe true nobility is about embracing follies.
And of course, the death of God, and what that means for us, for how we understand the world.
Big questions.
Yeah, Nietzsche, he forces us to confront these big questions.
He doesn't give us any easy answers.
No, but maybe that's the point.
Maybe it's about asking the right questions. Yeah. And then finding our own way.
So, we've only scratched the surface here.
There's so much more to explore in The Gay Science.
And if any of these ideas have really resonated with you, I'd encourage you to, keep digging.
It's worth the effort.
Yeah. So thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
It's been a pleasure.
All right, we'll see you next time.
See you.